of the things we talk about at Radical Mentoring is you always start on time and you always end on time, to honor the time commitment of the people that are here with you. Why don't we just take a moment and just throw out to me just the reasons why you chose to come into this session. Of all places to be this afternoon, you chose to be in here. And might be what you're thinking of when you hear the word mentor. What kind of drew you into this specific session? Just throw out some ideas. I might write them on this, some thoughts. I might write them up here.
Because I have young associates who work for me that I want to.
Okay. Love it. Who else? Anybody thinking about transitioning a business and thinking about younger leaders? I knew that, Ted. I was teeing you up for that one. And I was teeing you up for that one. Love it. So a couple business transitions. Love it. Who else?
Developing leaders.
Good.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, love it. No, I've got some of that. We'll show you for sure.
Create the right
Culture, love it. Great. Okay, so you'd like to be mentored. That's great. Awesome. And we're working on some really concrete next steps through FCCI, and then I'll also share some other things. Great. Who else?
Working with university students that
Okay.
are connected to campus ministry.
Love it. Perfect. So we've got young associates, business transition, developing leaders, creating culture. May just want to be mentored. How do you maybe engage with university students are all great ideas. Throw out to me when you hear the word mentor, or what comes to mind? It could be a word. It could be a person. What are you thinking about when you see the word mentor? Coach. Love it. Come alongside. Great. Heard somebody. Was it advisor? Counselor, come alongside, great. Trust, good. Disciple, great. Please don't report back to my mother on my handwriting either. That'd be bad. Great, all great answers. What some things you didn't say were teacher, expert, because I think there's a chemistry that happens in these mentoring relationships that's really not about how much you know. It really is more about your willingness and desire to come alongside some people, to coach them, to counsel, pray with them, to disciple them. Build relationships. We oftentimes get asked, what's the difference between discipleship and mentoring? There is really none. We were started by a business guy, and mentoring was just a word that he used that was more cultural, normal for him. Sometimes when we start throwing around words like discipleship and other things, this is going to sound bad, it might feel too churchy, which for some people that can be intimidating. Our environments exist for people that are followers of Christ, but still sometimes they start to think discipleship may mean something that they may not be quite qualified to be a part of. And so we want to really try to break down some of those things there. So I want to start with a couple stories that have happened in and around our community in Atlanta. My default language is to talk specifically about and to men, but please don't hear that as being a super gender specific. This only works in that environment. We have a men and a women's model. I just haven't quite trained myself to catch myself to switch back. But these two stories in particular have to do with men in our community, both well-established businessmen, both late in their careers. So one gentleman in particular had run a very successful insurance practice, had a great family. He had been in around our family and my wife, my in-laws, community for years. Member of a country club, had a second home in the mountains, member of a country club there. And in theory, you know, on the surface, if you looked at his life, you would have thought, got it figured out. He's sort of entering into that fourth quarter with some runway and some capacity to lead. Wakes up on a Sunday morning, he tells his wife that he's not going to go to church that morning because he had a headache. Probably something that all of us have said at one point or the other about not feeling 100% like going to church. So wife goes to church, comes back to find her husband in the bottom of the swimming pool with a series of letters laid out on the kitchen counter to her, to his kids, to his grandkids. He had a whole lot of things going on in the background that he never told anybody about, and so he ended up committing suicide over the time period where she left, went to church, and came home. The police get there and they notice footsteps from the pool into the house, through the house, and back out to the pool, and their only determination was he couldn't drown himself, and so he was walking in and out of the house trying to find something that would weigh him down enough that he could sink to the bottom of the pool and stay there. Second story, another prominent person in Atlanta had owned a really successful franchise of a growing moving company. He had sold that franchise, had made a lot of money, viewed very successfully in sort of the world's eyes as the guy that had it together. Hindsight, he'd made some bad financial decisions with the money that he made, and so he was having to go back and get a real job. Put on a suit and a tie every day, go in, and so he was getting ready to be hired as the CFO of a company that was, in fact, company my wife still works for. He gets the job. He's next day at work, doesn't show up to work. He committed suicide that night before. So I tell you all that not to depress you, but to just give you a little perspective that, you know, statistically speaking, if you look across every category, there is one thing that men right now are doing better than women. That's suicide. The highest rate of suicide, the category that to me is the most shocking, is that for 75-plus-year-old men, that's the highest suicide statistic. And I think if you boil all of that down, I think it comes back to a loss of identity. When you're looking ahead to, I'm transitioning my business, what's next for me, loss of purpose. You know, for my entire career, I've showed up in this place and I've raised up these employees, and this has been sort of the child that I brought into the world, and now I'm getting ready to step away from that. So loss of identity and loss of purpose seem to be the things that are, at least in those stories that probably are not unique to Atlanta, they're probably happening in pockets all around the country, that as we transition away from the thing that has been so dominant in our lives. I think somebody said it, maybe Carl this morning said, you know, we spend more time in the office than we do at church. Oftentimes we spend more time at the office than we do with our families. When that begins to shift, where are we going to start to spend our time and energy? Arthur Brooks, who wrote this book called Strength to Strength, talks about these two curves. From the 20s to 40s, it's this success curve where we're learning at a rapid rate, we're conquering things, we are sort of in this high growth mode, our brain's developing, we're retaining more information. Then he talks about the wisdom curve that begins to happen after that, from ages 40 to 80, when it's not your raw smarts that are growing, but it's just your ability to understand the places you've been and in the life that you've experienced, and your willingness to kind of turn back and share that information and really be helpful. But he talks about this specific thing called the striver's curse, which what he says is interesting is that it shows up in those people who tied their identity to other things early on in that rapid growth curve. And that when you get to age 65, half of us are happier and half of us are unhappy. And the difference was, you know, if you tie your identity to your kids and your kids' success, and all of a sudden your kids are out of the home, your ability to be happy is tied to your ability to strive. And I tell you all this really just to give you a little bit of that perspective that as we think about mentoring, yes, it's important to reach back to the generation coming behind us. It's important to train leaders and disciple, but it's also an important part of, I think, a lot of folks who are in this conference that are business owners that are starting to think about what happens when I transition out. What is that thing you're going to look forward to? Ecclesiastes says, meaningless, meaningless. It's all meaningless, right? And, in Ecclesiastes 2, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. So this idea of looking ahead and mentoring also is a bit of perspective, right? It's a bit of that idea that you're able now to look back at some of those key moments in your life and career and your marriage and your family, and you're able to look back and see your new young associates who are all of a sudden they're starting to get a little momentum and the billables are going up and the money's coming in, and you can go, I've been there. And here may have been some decisions I made along the way that probably didn't turn out the exact way I would have hoped to and caused a little bit of damage. And I just want to make sure that I'm helping you understand some of those decisions that you don't have the perspective yet to fully think through. And so that's a little bit of that idea of that mentoring model. So if you look at culture today, I think if you were kind of trying to summarize some of the narratives that you see, you really kind of hear these stories. Be true to yourself. In the end, do whatever makes you happy. We all know that's a fleeting thought because what makes you happy changes about every 10 to 15 minutes. Live however you want to live, just don't hurt anybody along the way. And nobody has the right to tell anyone what's right or wrong for them. Sort of this softening, this cultural softening that's starting to happen where, you even heard it in some of the Q&A today with the T-Factor folks. What do I do if there's, this pronoun problem I'm dealing with at the office? How do I have to navigate some of these new issues that spiral? And for every pronoun question that starts to come up, there's going to be another 5 or 10 that just continue to develop. And so how do we understand that the culture is going to say, hey, you can't tell anybody what's right or wrong. You just got to, keep the peace and make sure everybody's happy. But as leaders and as followers of Christ, we know there's more to it. We know we have an idea, a working idea for how to find meaning in life, to find purpose. We know how true contentment and satisfaction feel. We know that when we lived and pursued other things and that left us feeling empty, we know how we can find that true contentment and satisfaction. We have this secure identity. We're not getting blown left or right trying to sort of find the car or the job or the house or the neighborhood or the country club that brings us satisfaction. We've got this secure identity that allows us to operate as sons and daughters of God. We have a hope and a way to handle suffering. We see it now in the workforce. If I don't like what Ted's saying, I'm just going to go find a job 2 doors down where they maybe pay me 25 cents more an hour or 25 cents less an hour. Doesn't really matter, but there was something that happened in my relationship with Ted, and I didn't like it, so I'm just not going to suffer through that one anymore. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to find a new one. And that perspective of hanging in there and having hope is really important. And this is what John Piper says in his book, Rethinking Retirement, which I think is really helpful. So finishing life to the glory of Christ means using whatever strength and eyesight and hearing and mobility and resources we have left to treasure Christ and in that joy to serve people. That is, to seek to bring them with us into the everlasting enjoyment of Christ. Serving people and not ourselves as the overflow of treasuring Christ makes Christ look great. It's that idea of helping people see who we want to see make great. And it's not about our own names and businesses, and it's really about helping Christ not that Christ needs our help to become famous, but I think you understand what I'm saying there. This was a quote from a former mentee who was in a mentoring group. And this was his perspective as you sort of look ahead to what mentoring could look like. His point was that to the mentor, you're so close to the lessons God has taught you throughout your life that they've actually become unremarkable to you. The reality is there's a generation that's coming behind you, and they haven't learned those lessons yet. For them to have access to your life and the lessons you've learned would profoundly influence the course of the days to come in their lives. And so for those of us who have got a little more life and a little more perspective, and by the way, it's not an age thing. If you've been a Christian for 5 minutes, you've got somebody that hasn't been a Christian that you've got some wisdom that you can impart to them. If you've been a Christian for 50 years or a business owner for 50 years, you may have a broader audience of people that might be more interested in kind of that mentoring relationship with you. But we all have a generation that's ahead of us, and we all have a generation that's behind of us. Age is not this kind of expiration date that if you're connected to Christ, you'll flourish and you're still going to grow. And there's importance to that. In the future, when your son asks you, what does this mean? You tell him, with a mighty hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. There's experiences, there's markers that you all have had in your life that others haven't seen, and you've got the ability to point them back and say, hey, things might seem really great right now, things might not seem really great right now, but here's some areas and places where the Lord showed up in my life. Let's talk about reaching back, and then we'll get a little bit more technical. This is from Adam's Return by Richard Rohr, which is pretty accurate when you study what's happening culturally today, that in the absence of any real eldership or mentorship, 17-year-olds turn to other 17-year-olds for pseudo-initiation, and young Turks in the business world seek help from other young Turks. I don't know what a young Turk in the business world is, but that's what he said. The blind is leading the blind. And so when I think about men specifically, there's this sin, guilt, shame cycle that we all sort of seem to get ourselves stuck into, that rather than expose ourselves to somebody that's a little further ahead of us, we're going to surround ourselves with peers, and we're going to get our advice from peers who are thinking about what might be a great answer, who have no life experience, or we're going to look up the answer, and Google will give us 4 million responses to how to live a better life in less than a second. We'll have all these choices to choose from. So there's this undercurrent of kind of peer-to-peer relationships that's happening today. But there's also, I think, as encouraging is, if you look at some of the research from the Fuller Institute that did some work studying churches that were growing younger, one of the things they saw in that research is there's a deep hunger for the older generation to want to connect with the younger generation. And there's a deep desire for the younger generation to find those mentoring relationships and try to build community that bridges generations. And so while this is happening, this sort of peer-to-peer mentoring relationships, culturally, I think there's huge opportunities, but oftentimes it's just the hindrance is sometimes not knowing what to do. You said content. What's the content? What's the process? Oftentimes that's the issue, is not having necessarily a place to go. And I think somebody mentioned this scripture this morning, remembering the days of old, consider the years of many generations, ask your father and he will show you, your elders and they will tell you. This idea that the life experience is what will really help drive and shape where people go. And I love some specific things in this scripture out of Hebrews. It says, remember your elders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Anything in there that jumps out at you? Any words? Mm-hmm. Love it. The why outcome, Kevin?
Because it takes the focus
love it. And the outcome of what? What's the outcome of?
Their way.
That's right. Their way of life, not an outcome of some of the decisions or some of the knowledge that they accumulated. It's really the outcome of their way of life. That's what's attractive, and that's what I think we've learned at Radical Mentoring over the years is what has made groups that we have really successful, quote unquote successful, is it's really that you've got men and women who are considering and living out a way of life that's attractive to the generation that's behind them. It's not this teacher-student relationship. It's really a intergenerational friendship and respect that seems to happen because it's focused on the way of life and the imitation of their faith. That there's a faith quality in each of you that somebody's going to see and go, I don't really know what it is about Ted, but I think I'd like to, I'm picking on you, Ted, because you're there and you got your name tag on. But I think I just want to spend a little more time with, I want to understand what his family's like. They may see your wife comes in the office and they may see a connection that the two of you have that's maybe different than what they're having at home. And so there's something happening as they're observing a way of life. They're not going, Ted gave a great lecture this morning on the importance of marriage. You know, that might be important to them, but they're really observing the way that you're living is what's creating the stickiness in those mentoring relationships. So here's the model that we ascribe to. And why don't I just take a pause for a second? That was sort of a lot of fluffy stuff at the beginning. We can get a little more technical here. But I think it's good content and perspective in terms of what we're seeing. What questions are you kind of coming in here today, this afternoon, with about mentoring? Anything specific that I know Frank Harrison mentioned it and Mark mentioned it a couple times? Anything that you've got to get answered before you get out of here that I can make sure I cover? Anybody have anything specific?
I think in men's ministry at church,
Mm-hmm.
launching something like this, and I talked to a few men about this, and I think the biggest question that I get that I don't know how to answer is, how do you know who you're going to be your mentor? Do you ask? You can just go up and ask somebody, hey, you want to be my mentor? Or the other way around, hey, you want to be mentored?
Yep.
So there's naturally not the right.
So I'm just going to put that as at church. How does this work? And that's a good enough hint for me to know. That's a great. We'll talk through that for sure.
So do you ever do any husband-wife mentoring?
Okay, great. Great. Anybody else? And because I think, and the reason I wrote at church is because there's going to be some nuances, obviously, between how you can do this at church, how you can do this in an environment like FCCI, which is kind of a para-church ministry of like-minded people, versus how you can actually pull this off inside your workplace. Those are sort of three different applications for sure. So I'll tell you sort of how our organization sort of came to be, if you will, and then how this sort of model developed. So there's a guy by the name of Reggie Campbell. Reggie passed away about a little over 3.5 years ago now. And he was I think he spoke at an FCCI conference at some point over the last several years. I think he'd been invited to speak at one. Reggie was an entrepreneur. He was fairly successful business guy and sort of what he would probably say were the eyes of the world. Sort of his qualifications, for those that didn't know him well, would have thought business box gets checked, family gets checked, everything sort of looks really good. Reggie was a little bit late as a believer, but Reggie's personality was he was going to fully jump into anything that he did. And so he was at an early church in Atlanta, and he and his wife were assigned the singles ministry. And so what he started to realize is there was a lot of young guys that would say, hey, Reggie, can we get a cup of coffee? Hey, Reggie, can we meet at the Waffle House? Hey, Reggie, can we go for a walk? Whatever it might be, there was just a lot of individual men that wanted his time and attention. And so as he began to pour into the lives of a lot of younger guys, he was struck by a quote by a guy named Tim Elmore who said, "More time with fewer people is a greater kingdom impact." More time, fewer people, greater kingdom impact. And so what Reggie just basically started to do was say no. You know, Ryan comes up and says, "Hey, Reggie, can we have coffee?" And Reggie would go, "No, can't, Ryan. I'm going to put you on a list of guys. I'm going to really do this, trying to really get intentional with my time. And so I'm going to invite you to be a part of a mentoring group next year when I launch my next one. But I'm really not doing a lot of these one-on-one coffees." Not that there's anything wrong with that, but he said, Reggie's words were, "I didn't see a lot of fruit." That he was kind of putting bubble gum on the Hoover Dam, and at some point it was going to break, and those little pieces of bubble gum weren't going to do much good. And so whether it was a marriage problem or a business problem or a relationship problem, Reggie just said, "You know what, I'm going to invite 8 guys to my house." The magic for Reggie of 8 was those were the number of chairs he had around his dining room table. There was not a lot of science to it. He was going to give them a year of his life. And he was going to invite them over once a month for 3 hours. They were going to read books, so he pulled off the books that meant the most to him off of his bookshelf. He opened his Bible and wrote down the scripture that meant the most to him, and they were going to memorize scripture together. He had some homework assignments that he either made up or he would borrow from things that he had read along the way, mostly marriage-related homework assignments or spiritual development assignments. And so they'd meet once a month for 3 hours. He'd send these guys out. They'd do some one-on-one meetings with each other. He might get together with them one-on-one throughout that month. Then they'd all come back on the pre-decided date. They were highly committed. It wasn't an environment where, you know, sometimes you came, sometimes you didn't. Reggie would say, "Look, don't do this if you're getting ready to have a baby, you want to go to medical school. This is a once a month for 3 hours, hard, fast commitment. I'm opening up my home. I'm going to give you my life. I'm going to share my story with you. You owe me the same level of commitment." And so that's what he started to do in 2001, was just invite. He'd send an email out to 15 or 20 guys. He would say, this is literally what he would write. I got this email in late 2001. "Write your obituary and send it back to me." Begin with the end in mind, right? So that was Reggie's qualification was, and Mike can attest to this. Mike was in one of Reggie's groups. It was like, I just want to make sure I'm getting people that, in his mind, he wanted heat-seeking business guys. Because in Reggie's own story, that's where he got off the rails. That's not the same story for every mentor that we have, but for Reggie, it was, I want to get the young, aggressive, money-hungry Christian, probably maybe little c Christian, that they weren't really quite sure how to integrate that into all these other dreams and goals in life, and he wanted those to be the guys that he brought in. And so that's what he started to do. He wrote this book, Mentor Like Jesus, that essentially just laid out Reggie kind of, as he reflected on what he was doing, he wrote this in 2010. He realized all he was really doing was following the model that Jesus had already done. So it was on purpose, it was selfless. Group context, that's a different nuance. Oftentimes people think mentoring is these one-on-one relationships, which can create some of your point, some of that awkwardness of like, all right, Ed's going to be my mentor and we're going to meet at Starbucks. See, I'm picking on Ed now. What do you want to talk about, Ed? I don't know. What do you want to talk about, Kevin? I don't really know. And so that would have this sort of share your story early on, and then that would kind of peter off because there just wasn't a lot of intentionality to it. So the group allows the group to mentor each other and allows the mentor to facilitate the group conversation. It was a short, defined period of time. Reggie's belief was after a year, I'm going to start repeating myself. And so I'm going to give you a year of my life, and then I'm going to go find another group. If you guys want to continue to get together, great, but my mentoring relationship with you in this group setting ends after a year. Scripture was at the core, obviously. At the time, Jesus didn't have a Bible, but he was constantly quoting and reflecting on the Old Testament. Scripture memory is a huge part of these mentoring groups. It was this modeling environment. Jesus taught them how to pray. Jesus wept. Jesus modeled openly what was going on in his life. He handpicked his mentees. He prayed specifically for the men that God would bring to him. There was a mutual commitment, and it required multiplication. So the big thing with for our groups is always that idea that if you've been mentored, at some point down the road, you do this for another group of people. And so the model that we sort of follow is this idea that this is what Jesus did. So for us today as an organization, we work with 650 we call partners, which for us is a lot of churches. And so there's a couple applications that we'll talk about in a second. We have over 3,200 of these mentoring groups that have happened since we started this. Over 2,400 people are mentors, over 22,400 mentees in 43 states and 14 countries. The model today is not that dramatically different than what Reggie did back in 2001 when he started doing these groups. I'll do next steps, and I'll show you some of the content, and we'll have some Q&A along the way. So through FCCI, in my conversations with Ryan and Bobby Mitchell Jr. and others, their dream is to take our model and create an FCCI-specific mentoring model that has a little bit more business-centric to it versus our traditional model is, again, very, very spiritual and Christ-centered, but it doesn't have as much workplace. How do you're trying to teach somebody how to run the business the right way? There's some things that FCCI offers and all of its content that is going to be really important. So they're going to be in the process of firming up their own version of this, which can be used either as an extension of FCCI groups. It can be used as, just in the way of some of these extended community area groups as well. So there's a next step code in the booklet that you can snap that and you can say, I'm interested in being a mentor, I'm interested in being mentored, and then we'll start the follow-up process post-conference. So that's an exciting development for us to know that FCCI wants to put this in place because they want to really help some of this intergenerational discipleship happen in the workplace. Kind of in the more traditional sense, our website's radicalmentoring.com. That's where you'll find all of our men's and women's content, which I'll show you sort of what that looks like, and I'll walk you through what a radical mentoring season looks like as well. So the three applications really are, you can do this on your own. You're kind of a Reggie kind of guy that just has an ongoing list of younger men and women who, men if you're a man, women if you're a woman, which will get me to your question, Ted, as well. You just keep a list of those kinds of people that have wanted to spend time with you, and you decide, I need to be a little more intentional. So you can do this on your own. That's where you use that website for that. You can take this to your church if you're active in your men's ministry in your church and you feel like or women's ministries, and you feel like there's places where there's another step for discipleship that's necessary. This is a great step for that. We work with a lot of churches and help them see that events are great, small groups are great, but you want to have another place for somebody to land if they're willing to say, hey, I want to take another step. And so these mentoring environments end up developing the leadership culture and the discipleship culture at a church for both men and women. Then there's the business context, whether it's through FCCI or whether you want to do this traditionally through your work, which is what a lot of they talked about this morning. That's probably doing it through your work is the toughest row to hoe, just because we're asking people to commit to hourly meeting, 3-hour meetings, and does it happen in the office, out of the office? All the stuff that kind of got fleshed out today are still the things that Coke Consolidated is trying to navigate as it relates to mentoring. What they've done really is Dave Katz and Frank Harrison have led radical mentoring groups with some people who are employees of Coke and with some people that aren't. And it's really more about a radical mentoring environment more than it is a super Coke-specific mentoring model. But those are really kind of your next steps and your application. So I'm going to switch off this real quick and show you. I'll just show you the website. Oops, I haven't signed out of that. Let's see. What other questions can I answer for you before I just show you a little bit of the process, which I think will help answer some of the other questions that you had. Ted, real quick on husbands and wives, we have never found it to work very well because there's typically one spouse who's a little more open and transparent than the other spouse, and the greatest value that happens in these groups is the story sharing that happens at the very beginning, where you just create space and around a campfire for guys to share the good, the bad, the ugly of their stories with each other, the mentor to do that. And oftentimes, those are the safe spaces where men sort of come alive a little bit. And sometimes a wife is not comfortable with what a husband's willing to share, or vice versa. So we haven't quite figured out a model that has created that balance.
Really my thought there is, I know leaders in companies, men can be at this point where they just get going, and the wife can sort of not be part of that.
Yeah.
So how do you bring these future leaders, so it might be the two groups meet separate?
Yeah, exactly right.
That's more what
You got it. Yeah, we see that happen where it really is a men's group and a women's group. They just happen to be married and they are reading similar books, and then there are some opportunities to come together where you get some of that shared experience. We've seen that happen for sure. Any other questions before I jump into some of the content? Go ahead, Mike.
How much does it cost?
That's a great question, Mike. You see right here, somewhere on there, our resources are free, which is you're sitting here thinking, as you run businesses, why would you give anything away for free? Or the perception oftentimes is, if you give it away for free, it's probably not that great anyway, so just give it away for free. I can tell you that second one is definitely not true. Our ministry heart has always been that we will be funded by men, women, churches, partners who've been touched by the ministry. We just want you to experience it first, because what we don't want you to do is pay $39.99 a month for something that's no good, or is really heavy content. And what we wanted to do, as I'll show you, is just create a framework that allows you to have these facilitated conversations around topics. And then we'll reach out to you at the end of that and say, Ryan, did you like the experience? Is it something you'd be willing to pay forward so that other churches or groups can get launched? And then we come behind it. So we have some generous donors like the McGraw family and others who've been touched by it, who really allow us to do some of these things and say, hey, we don't want to keep this as this little thing. We want to make sure we get it in the hands of others. I was in Egypt last November because we translated Mentor Like Jesus into Arabic, and there's about 100 men and women across the Middle East going through groups like this. Not because that was a thing that was on our 5-year vision plan, but because we've got some great donors, and when this opportunity came to us, it was really unique and special, and we're able to see that through because we've got the people that come behind us. So we do give this all away for free. There's no place on here that you'll find this secret code where we request a credit card. So if you go to the main page, you'll see for men, for women, for business. They give you, if you create one account, you get access to all three of those. I should have done this before. So when you come to the site, what you'll see is literally everything that you will need to launch a group, whether it's on your own or through a church or through your business. The good news is everything's there. The bad news is it can be really overwhelming at times. So we've got a team of folks, myself and two others at our office, that our heart is to really partner with you so that you don't go to a website and go, this is really overwhelming, I can't do this. That there's a phone call, a Zoom call, a visit where we can help you understand how to make this work. I'm going to just take you to the kind of the meat and potatoes portion of it, which is really the tracks. So what we give you is a recommended 9-month track, a recommended 12-month track, and you'll see, you can't see it great, but you'll see sort of a flow of topics. The women's follows this exact same model, where we really want to get you focused on what we would call kind of the inner man first. So helping you understand your story, helping you understand how you see God. I mean, if you go back to those stories at the beginning, the issues most men face is they don't have a great perception of who God is. They have a really poor perception of how God sees them. And they really don't think anybody cares, so they don't step into community. So it's a question of theology, identity, and community are really the things that most men really begin to wrestle with. So we start with some of these inner man issues, theology, prayer, character, and then we shift and get you to start thinking about how do those things impact my sexual integrity, my marriage, my priorities, my parenting. We've got a whole nother list of topics you can choose from if some of these don't resonate with you. So we're going to give you a 9-month plan or 12-month plan, and then you have the ability just to literally go down here at the bottom and click on one of these buttons that says binder and print out every piece of information that you would need as a mentor for that entire mentoring season. I'm just going to show you this one-page document called the Matrix, which will just give you sort of a sense of the process. So you'll see in here the different meetings. You start with a retreat, a story retreat. You end with a commencement retreat. But you'll see sort of the flow of the topic. So if you're talking about theology, you're going to read this book, The Good and Beautiful God by James Bryan Smith. You're going to have a couple of homework assignments that are relational or personal. Here are the 2 scriptures you're going to memorize, and you're going to come back together the next month, and that's going to be the framework of the 3-hour conversation. And so what we've tried to do here is just lay all this out in a way that allows you as the mentor to be confident that there's content there that's been well vetted and thought through. So you're not left with a 3-hour meeting, and especially for men, we'll figure out, we can only talk about the weather for so long. Then you got to go to the Braves. And then you have about 2.5 hours of time to fill. And so we want to give you kind of this process that allows you to see how the flow of a meeting works. The most critical thing for us is these story retreats that happen in the beginning. Because what happens is, if I begin to share my story and share some of the warts in my story, all of a sudden Mike, who thought he was the only guy in the world dealing with the issue he was dealing with, we have this heart connection because he goes, oh gosh, Kevin's, okay, it's safe now because I know Kevin just told his story and he's dealing with some of the same things. And so what happens in those story retreats is it accelerates the relationships to a degree that we have men say, I've met with a men's group for the last 10 years, and these guys know more about me in the first 90 days than these guys know about me, and I've met with them every Tuesday morning for 10 years. Because it's the stories that start with the mentor and then the mentees that really starts to bring the relationships to light. And so you're having conversations about prayer, but you're also having conversations about prayer through the lens of what you already know about the people in the group. And so there's some acceleration that really happens there along the way. And so this is really what we give you. And then I'll show you just real quickly, I'll pick a topic here and I'll just show you, in the binder you'd see, let's see. Uh-oh. What you'll find in each section of the binder is a couple thoughts for you as you prepare to mentor your groups. And then you'll see a breakdown of what happens over those 3 hours. Here's when you talk about the books. Here's when you talk about the homework assignments. Here's how you reconnect on the front end. Here's where you pray and gather prayer requests from everybody else in the group. And so we just really try to hand all this to you so that you've got some guardrails that give you the freedom to know, okay, here's an agenda to follow, but also that you can just throw that agenda to the side because at some point somebody's going to walk in with some real life hard issue that they're dealing with, and they're going to drop that on the table because you've created a safe space for those mentees to want to engage with you. And so that's the model that we follow, and you see it all you'll see it all laid out for you on the website in a way that's we think is really easy to follow and track with. We've got an application on here. It's not Write Your Obituary, but it does. Each account has their own unique link, so you can send it out and people can tell you a little bit of their faith story. And if you don't know them well enough, you have more people than you're trying to figure out and vet to be in a group. It gives you the ability to do that, kind of all serviced here through the website. So that's sort of what we do. What questions can I answer for you along the way? We've got about 15 or so minutes left. And it can cover anything or everything.
Are these all in a geographic area, so they're face-to-face versus a virtual?
Great question. So the
Versus a
question
virtual
was-
group.
Yeah. Great question was, do you do this face-to-face, kind of geographically focused, or do you try to do this virtually? Virtual is really hard in this environment. A fully virtual group, I don't think works really well. I think we've learned, like we all did over COVID, that there are some ways to navigate some virtual stuff, but it's really the story retreat that's the most impactful. And to do that, you really need that face-to-face time. And then now we're seeing if Mike has a last-minute trip that pops up, you know, maybe you put a laptop on the end of the table and let him participate virtually, but you don't give Mike the free pass to be virtual for the entire group. Because there's, as you know, there's just too much happens relationally in those groups. It's too important. So that's where you have that flexibility to say, hey, this may not be the right season for you based on things that are happening. Maybe that shifts a little bit in the FCCI model because you've already got some relational capital built in just based on network. But in an ideal world, you're really gathering face to face.
What's the optimum size?
Great question. Optimum size of a group, it's mentor or co-mentor. So we're starting to see groups where you have 2 and 6 to 8 mentees. I've done 4, I've done 3, I've done 6 in my own groups, and 6 really is a good healthy number. 8 can be a little more challenging just because you've got more people and more talk time.
Are you asking the mentees to then facilitate their own group afterwards, or is there a next step or takeaway?
In an ideal world, yes, but as you know, not everybody is, the way we see, I'll use church as an example. For a church, oftentimes the church is able to say, here's a menu of places where you might want to serve, and we may need you to serve in a place that's not being a mentor. Maybe it's you're going back in and you're just leading a small group, and what we see happen time after time is if you've had an experience like this, you're not going to go back into your small group and let it sort of live in the shallowy surface thing. So the elevation of the intentionality in the groups all starts to rise because of the shared experience people have had. Some will say, yeah, I'm ready to mentor a group. Some will say, I'll be your, you co-mentor with me this next time around and we'll learn it together. But I'm a great example. Mike, you've led your first group, right? It took me 10 or 12 years from when I went through the mentoring group to when I led a group. Part of that was life, confidence. I had to stub my toe a lot to feel like I had some value to add along the way. So it's not necessarily a multiplication happens, but it's not all of a sudden you got 6 more groups that go because some just aren't. Some may never lead a group. Some will just go home and be better husbands and dads and better employees and neighbors, and that may be the big win. That may be the only win you get out of some people. Mike, is that a fair answer to your experience?
Yeah, I think so. That's going to be one of my questions is what would you tell somebody who's like, oh man, I don't know if I can be a very good mentor?
I think you tell them that.
I'm not super wise. I don't have
Yeah.
a lot of things to say.
I think you tell them 2 things. One, you've got some people that are a season of life behind you that will still think you may be the wisest person in the room, whether or not you feel like you're wise or not. You've got some value that you can add to a group that's coming behind you. Or just prayerfully begin to look for people that can be the kind of person that would fit your mentoring group, and over time you'll find a window where that ask can be made and you'll launch that group.
So the material runs for a year.
Mm-hmm.
So is there more than 1 year's worth of material so that you're not doing the same track every year?
For the mentor, there is more than 1 year, but typically that mentor finishes that group and they go roll right back into a new group. And so the material will be new for the group, may not be quite as fresh for you as the mentor, which in some ways is helpful, especially that second year around.
I did a different thing.
Yeah,
Similar,
yeah.
but I did it for 7 years.
Yeah, by the time you're like, yeah. Some people will change books
Yeah.
to help give a little freshness to it, and then everybody starts to put their own twist on it. So we give sort of the framework, but we'll have groups that will say, we really want to study the Bible more. And so we're going to find a YouVersion plan, and we're going to create a group inside YouVersion, and we're going to do this in addition to what we're doing, meeting monthly. We're going to have sort of these. So there's certain things you can do that allow you to either adjust to the needs of the group or do something that just sort of gets you fired up. Because I think you're right. Reading the same book every year for 7 years is, and the same assignments, it's still really fresh to those, but part of this is keeping yourself fresh. And so sometimes you can find, we do have enough material that you could pull another round, or we have recommended 2 or 3 different books under each track as well. So you can find some ways to twist it. And if you were to take the book out, you don't have to go back in and find it in 74 different places. The book lives on that matrix document, and it doesn't live anywhere in the follow-on stuff. So if you change the prayer book from Praying Life by Paul Miller to Prayer by Tim Keller, you change it one time, and then everything else just says the book. So you're not stuck to having to go, all right, if I change it, I'm going to have to spend 3 days trying to find out all the little secret places where it's hidden. You got it. Yep. Great question. Go ahead, Tim.
Does FCCI have a time frame for when they're looking at trying to get their thing together? Any idea?
I don't know, but I know we're getting close because I've gotten some back and forth correspondence on book lists and some things, which is, I think it's really helpful because it's cleaner for them too. And that's been our joy, is even if a church says, we don't want to call it radical mentoring, it's like, just take it, white label it, call it what you want to call it, because it has to fit the context. And so I think hopefully that's coming soon. I know they've got a lot of book lists and stuff they're working through. And then the goal is we host some mentor training sessions virtually, and we host some mentee sort of vision casting meetings together where we can help FCCI put these things together so it starts to accelerate. But that's what Ryan and I have been doing a lot of talking about. Go ahead.
So is the men and women's track currently available, but the business one is going to be the FCCI one?
Yeah, we have one up here that says for business. It's not very good because we're not business people. The value FCCI is going to have is they're going to be looking at it solely through that business lens, and they're going to add some context and some content that's real business specific that will benefit us. But for right now, the men and the women are the 2 cleanest ones. The business one, it feels a little bit of a hybrid between the men and the women, sort of blended. So I think I just said our stuff wasn't very good, just in that one category, I promise. Got maybe 2 more minutes, 1 or 2 more questions? Concerns?
My understanding is to be a mentor is for them to first be a mentee to see how it works.
Nope. Your only requirement is your desire to disciple and mentor somebody else and your willingness to share your story. And it's because it's not it's not a lot of theology and understand. I mean, it's really, Reggie was a business guy who just decided, I can't meet with all these people one-on-one. I'm just going to start pulling books off my bookshelf and pulling assignments and pulling scripture, and I'm just going to open my life, and if I don't know the answers, I'm going to say I don't know. And we're going to journey in this together. And so, now, first year is always the hardest because you're learning the homework assignments and you're learning the books and you're mentoring and you're participating at the same time, which is hard. But it's best just to jump off the diving board into the deep end. And there's just a lot there to keep you in check too. One last question, then I'll let you go on to your somewhat free afternoon. Go ahead, Kevin.
So, if you have someone in mind who could use a mentor, like say your son, who probably you shouldn't be their mentor, is there a good way to connect them with a good mentor?
Reggie mentored his own son twice. One of the only few people that had to go through the mentoring program 2 times was Ross Campbell, just for the record. So we don't have a great matchmaking service because it's too hard for us to vet and figure out, is Kevin the real deal, or does Kevin have something in his basement that he really doesn't want us to know about? So churches, that's part of the church kind of context that's helped us, is we can go to the church and say, you've got a guy who has a desire to do this, let's help you figure out how to implement this. And then they've got young guys, and they start to figure out how to put those things together. So we don't have a great meet a mentor service, other than you may know a guy who's going to do this, and you say, hey, son, I think this is, I think Mike would be a great guy for you, and so we're going to connect you over there into Mike's group. So one hand over here. Yep.
Sharing a little experience, that mentoring, it doesn't end mostly ones or twos. And some of them have come to me and said, would you mentor me?
Mm-hmm.
And some I have gone to and said, I think it would be a good thing for us to do.
I love it.
And so you can take the initiative and it works okay.
Yep.
Or you can simply see what that's going to bring.
I love it.
Like I said,
Yeah, that's great. And that we've tried to do a little bit of that one-on-one and group and try to combine the best of both worlds, because not everybody has that mentality around owning those one-on-one relationships. And so the group helps sort of keep some of that together, but then you get one-on-one with the mentor throughout. And so it helps build some of those one-on-ones. But that's great feedback.
based on the content, is there a minimum age for people as mentees?
The minimum, age, no. You want to keep married guys with married guys and singles with singles, and same vice versa for women, just because there's a similarity in conversation that needs to happen. Your 15-year-olds are hard, and college students are hard for some degree, because they're already reading and consuming so much stuff, and their schedules are so busy that sometimes it's harder to get them to commit. Although we have a high school mentoring track that is sort of ad hoc, that somebody said, hey, I'm going to have these guys read read an article. Maybe we'll watch a couple sermons, and I'm going to give them some things along the way. So they've taken sort of our framework and pulled some things out to make it work. But it's not great for those high school kids. Obviously, marriage assignments don't work for high school kids. Sorry about that. Nope, can't do it virtually. Good try. Good? We're at 2 minutes left. I don't really have a great whiz-bang, awe-inspiring close, so I'm happy to take a couple more questions. Awesome. Well, thank you guys for doing this. I've loved being a part of the conference. I've known the Mitchells for a long time. I've led Young Life groups with Lee and been around Bobby and Chris and Bobby and Sue for years, and I know how much this means to them. And I think, as Frank Harrison said, that Billy Graham said, that the movement of God in the marketplace is really going to be a big deal. And it is not about what you know, it's really about how you live. And there's an attractiveness to that you're going to have people that are going to want to be a part of it. And we just love having a framework that allows you to do that in a way that helps you focus more on the relationships and less on the content part, and just really make yourselves available. So if we can help you, that's all my contact information. That was my cell phone number up front that was on the front slide. I don't know if we had you register when you walked in here, so I can't necessarily get the presentation to you, but my email is kevin@radicalmentoring.com, or you can just text me, which is 770-710-7596, and send me the presentation, and I'll get it over to you. That way you can see it. Thank y'all.
Thank you.